Good evening, friends. Tonight, we begin with the extraordinary lives and quiet resilience of medieval girls trapped in the merciless marriage market of the 1300s. Before they could even spell their own names, some were already being measured for political alliances, judged not by their dreams, but by the weight of their dowries and the thickness of their cloak hems. Their futures weren't woven with threads of love, but priced out in bolts of cloth and squawking chickens. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, droning hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval hall is dimly lit, smoky, the air thick with a stew of odors, stale rushes, a damp hearth, the faint, suspicious tang of boiled turnips, and the unmistakable tension of negotiation. Seated on a rough wooden bench is a girl, maybe 12 or 13. Her hands are folded neatly in her lap, but she doesn't fidget. She knows better. Just beyond the woven curtain, her father and two other men are finalizing what amounts to her entire future, and not one of them seems inclined to ask what she thinks about it. Dowries in the 1300s weren't just tradition. They were survival kits for brides, a package of value to sweeten the deal, grease the wheels of alliance, and assure everyone the bride wouldn't arrive empty-handed. Or worse, empty-headed. A typical dowry might include livestock, the more useful the better, a few linen sheets, some kitchenware, and if the family was feeling generous, a single tarnished necklace from an aunt who swore it had once been touched by a nun. For families of modest means, dowries were exhausting, high-stakes affairs. You weren't just giving away a daughter, you were transferring responsibility. And if the bundle of cloth, hens, and reputation didn't meet expectations, the entire plan could unravel faster than a wool tunic near an open flame. Among nobles, the stakes were higher and infinitely pettier. Land deals were negotiated alongside marriage contracts, turning betrothals into miniature diplomatic summits. A daughter could be married off to secure a peace treaty, cancel a debt, or win the favor of a cousin's liege lord's brother-in-law, who just happened to own a crucial river crossing. Romance, as you might guess, rarely entered the equation. Historians still argue whether dowries functioned as a woman's early inheritance or as leverage to control her movements after marriage. Either way, the truth remains. Dowries dictated the terms of a girl's life long before she ever stood beside a church altar. Back in the hall, the girl's mother adjusts her veil, glancing at her daughter with a smile meant to reassure. It doesn't. Everyone knows what's happening, but no one speaks of it directly. Even the priest lingering by the wall, his expression hovering between neutral and mildly bored. Is there more as a witness than a blessing? The church might preach spiritual equality, but it had no qualms about lending legitimacy to property transactions disguised as holy unions. Unless you think this process was always dry and humorless, here's a detail that might surprise you. In some villages, it was customary to include a symbolic trinket in the dowry, a carved spoon, a single cherry stone from a tree that never bore fruit again. These were little tokens meant to bring luck or mark the bride's uniqueness, superstition wrapped in sentimentality. Imagine handing your future in-laws a symbolic twig and declaring, "This means our daughter cries less than average." The negotiation itself might unfold over tankards of ale and a half-eaten loaf of rye bread. There'd likely be a minor argument over whether a second goose qualified as generosity or showboating. The girl, still silent, has by now been appraised more thoroughly than the family cow. Historical records confirm that in many medieval communities, girls as young as 12 could be legally betrothed, sometimes even married, with parental consent. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't scandalous. It was just Tuesday. Life expectancy hovered in the 40s if you were lucky. Childhood didn't stretch long, and puberty was treated less as a phase and more like an administrative green light. Once the match was agreed upon, the betrothal might be marked by a formal blessing, or simply by the passing of a sealed document and a nod. In rural areas, the rituals were even simpler. Sometimes, all it took was a handclasp in front of witnesses and an exchange of gifts. One story tells of a father who finalized his daughter's engagement by handing the groom a candle. Romantic, right? A flaming stick and a legally binding contract. What could possibly go wrong? Outdoors, the sky darkens, and wind curls under the threshold. Inside, the girl is handed a stiff embroidered cloth, something her aunt stitched while squinting by candlelight. It'll be packed with the dowry, a marker of her new household. She doesn't speak as she folds it again and sets it on her lap. In towns, especially those with merchant classes, matchmaking was often handled by middlemen, or, in some cases, middle nuns. Convents sometimes arranged marriages between feuding families, using the union as a peace treaty. The fact that the bride was essentially a human olive branch didn't strike anyone as odd. There were also practical matters to settle. What if the groom died before the wedding? Did the dowry stay with his family? Could it be reclaimed? These were real concerns. Legal loopholes were a medieval pastime. Some contracts even included clauses like, if the groom is found to have lice beyond a tolerable quantity, this agreement may be nullified. Let that sink in. You could be released from a marriage deal on the grounds of excessive lice. Medieval prenups had range. Meanwhile, the girl sits through it all, her face a mask of practiced calm. She knows what's expected: obedience, silence, grace. The way she walks, the way she places her hands, even the way she drinks water. These things have all been rehearsed. Because when your marriage is your family's best shot at survival, your posture becomes a form of currency. You might think this all sounds coldly transactional, and you'd be right. But tucked beneath the calculations were quiet moments of tenderness. A mother brushing back a strand of hair, an older cousin sneaking a smile, a whispered joke behind a raised goblet. Affection wasn't absent, it was buried under protocol, wrapped in obligation, and occasionally hidden under a pile of chickens. Later, as the hall empties and the fire burns low, the girl will be told the name of her future husband. Maybe she already knows it. Maybe he's 15 and shy. Maybe he's 32 and owns a small orchard. Maybe she saw him once at the harvest fair and remembers only that he wore too much green. The future is no longer hers to shape. But then again, in this world, it never really was. In the medieval world, age wasn't just a number. It was a social deadline. By the time a girl turned 12, her community no longer saw her as a child. She was marriage material, a phrase that sounds like a bad joke today, but was simply reality back then. Girlhood had a shockingly short shelf life, especially if the family farm needed consolidating or a local alliance was ripe for the picking. Church bells didn't just ring for holy days. They announced marriage intentions, sometimes for girls who'd barely learned to plait their hair. No one gasped, no one whispered. It was normal. You might wonder how anyone found this acceptable, but medieval people had entirely different definitions of childhood. Puberty was nature's way of handing out wedding invitations, and the church was all too happy to RSVP. Canon law technically permitted marriage for girls as young as 12 and boys at 14, provided there was consent. Though consent could mean anything from a solemn vow to not crying too loudly during the ceremony. While consummation might be delayed, the marriage contract itself was often sealed years earlier, locking two families into a deal crafted for politics, not personal preference. Picture a stone church reeking of damp wool and suppressed coughs. Candles sputter in the draft, their wax dripping like nervous sweat. A priest drones out the banns, announcing that Matilda, daughter of the local miller, will marry a boy she's spoken to exactly once, when he handed her a stick of dried quince at the Michaelmas fair. She hated quince. Now she'd have to pretend otherwise. No one asked if she was ready to raise children, keep house, or manage accounts. Readiness wasn't part of the conversation. The only metrics that mattered were biological capability and social expectation. If she looked tall enough to stir a pot and carry firewood, congratulations, she was of age. Some households prepped daughters for betrothal as soon as puberty's first signs appeared. Mothers discreetly mentioned their availability to neighbors. Fathers calculated how much cloth could be spared from winter weaving to sweeten a deal. Older women, especially widows, played a critical role too, teaching the subtle politics of presentation. How to bow just enough, speak softly without mumbling, and smile in a way that whispered modest but fertile. The girls adapted with the resilience of those who'd never known they had choices. One month, they played games in the yard. The next, they tried on betrothal veils. The pivot felt less jarring when everyone around you treated it as inevitable. Here's the haunting truth that often slips through historical cracks. The concept of childhood as a protected, carefree phase simply didn't exist. Kids were miniature adults in training, expected to contribute early and transition into roles as soon as physically possible. If that sounds exhausting, it was. But it was also ordinary. Even aristocratic girls weren't exempt. In fact, they faced more pressure, scrutiny, and less autonomy. Their marriages were planned at birth and rearranged like chess pieces, depending on which uncle had fallen from favor, or which estate needed uniting. It wasn't uncommon for a noble girl to be promised at 5, betrothed by 8, and ceremonially married by 12. Love rarely entered the conversation. Affection might bloom later, if you were lucky. One noble woman met her husband for the first time at their wedding. Her main observation? He had a wart on his ear and smelled strongly of mustard. A stunning start to marital bliss. Historians still debate whether these brides truly understood what was happening. Some argue they were sheltered and naive. Others point out that medieval children were exposed to adult responsibilities early and likely knew more than we credit them for. But comprehension wasn't required. Obedience was. In village streets, children mimicked the adults they saw. Girls played house, not with tiny tea sets, but by practicing sweeping, spinning wool, and rocking imaginary babies. This wasn't seen as troubling mimicry, but charming preparation. Here's a fringe detail. Some rural communities marked a girl's first menstruation with quiet rituals, less a personal milestone than a signal to the community. The news would travel, and suddenly, her name was spoken in new tones at the market. Less, she helps her mother with the goats. More, she'll make a fine wife once the dowry's ready. The pressure came from all sides. A girl's worth was tied to her ability to marry well, or at least decently. If her family was poor, the urgency was sharper. If rich, the stakes were strategic. but it always came. The church played a peculiar double role. On one hand, it preached consent and purity. On the other, it routinely blessed unions where the bride's opinion was purely theoretical. One preacher even advised marrying daughters off early to avoid the sins of lust, as if the only way to prevent trouble was to throw a child into it head first with a man twice her age. Occasionally, a young bride entered a household where she was treated kindly. A mother-in-law might take her under her wing. A husband might wait before making demands. But these were exceptions, not guarantees. Even then, she was expected to manage the household, prepare for children, and endure guests who pinched her cheeks with backhanded compliments. She'll be comely when she fills out. It was a crushing weight, but not all girls crumbled. Some adapted, some endured. A few even negotiated through quiet refusals or alliances with servants. Others found freedom in storytelling, festivals, or friendships with girls trapped in the same net. So when church bells rang and a pale, wide-eyed 12-year-old walked down the aisle in borrowed shoes, no one gasped. You heard approval? You saw nods. You saw the priest smile. Another contract completed. Another girl reshaped into someone else's future. Because in the 1300s, the age of marriage wasn't a milestone. It was a finish line. And some girls were expected to cross it before they'd even learned how to run. The story often began not with a priest, or even the girl herself, but with two men sitting on a worn bench, her father and some neighbor, cousin, or merchant from 2 villages over, nursing lukewarm ale in air, thick with barley and smoke. Their conversation would meander from livestock to rainfall, before casually sliding into far more consequential territory. So, your daughter's nearly of age then? The 1300s marriage market wasn't some literal marketplace, though one could be forgiven the confusion. It operated more like low atmospheric pressure settling over a village, emerging through convenience, seasonal necessity, and sometimes pure boredom. Deals shaping young girls' futures often began with phrases like, "Wouldn't it be something if," and ended with an exchange of chickens, land, or promises no one intended to keep. While nobles obsessed over lineage and heraldry, rural folk matched families based on who had grain, who had goats, and who had too many mouths to feed. A marriage could solve problems before they fully materialized. Too many sons on one farm? Marry one off and send him packing. Too few daughters to churn butter? Better fetch one from down the lane. It's easy to imagine these arrangements as heartless, but they weren't always. There existed a care akin to how a carpenter might smooth the edges of a stool before selling it. The girl's father wasn't necessarily cruel, just pragmatic. If the roof leaked, the cow limped, and the thatch needed replacing before winter, his daughter's wedding might be the only solution. In a world where certainty was rare, a good marriage deal was the closest thing to security. Negotiations could stretch across days, punctuated by church visits, bread breaks, and more ale. Each side postured as both generous and burdened. The girl's family might highlight her virtues. She churns butter without complaint, sings psalms, quiet as a mouse. The groom's side would admit with false modesty, "He's no beauty, but owns 3 pairs of boots. Isn't that more useful?" These talks were rarely just about the couple. They were about alliances, shared grain during famine, access to a well, fewer feuds, or joint ownership of an especially fat sow. If the groom's cousin had once insulted the bride's uncle, well, now they'd have to break bread at the wedding feast and pretend they'd never tried to poison each other's stew. Younger sisters listening through doors or peering from the loft learned early that their futures would be settled at these tables. They recognized the shift in tone, the glance from their father that meant, "Wear the blue dress tomorrow." Sometimes they even smiled at the visitor, practicing politeness like a second language. And when the guest left, they'd stare at the bench where he'd sat, wondering if they were supposed to feel anything at all. Historians still debate whether peasant girls had more agency than noble ones. Some argue lower classes allowed more personal choice, perhaps marrying someone familiar. Others counter that survival needs bulldoze preference, and a farmer could ignore his daughter's opinion as easily as any king. This brings us to one of medieval marriage's quiet brutalities. Once fathers agreed over ale or a shared joke, the betrothal might as well have been carved in stone. The girl would be informed, dressed appropriately, and expected to show humility, ideally even enthusiasm. If lucky, her match would be with a village boy she'd seen at the well. If less fortunate, an older widower needing a replacement wife. If truly cursed, someone her father owed a favor to, an arrangement settling debts, not building futures. There were cases of outright refusal, but defiance came at a cost. A girl who resisted too loudly risked being labeled difficult, prideful, or even touched in the head. After one failed betrothal, whispers might follow her to market, future matches evaporating like morning mist. Not every union was grim. Some couples grew fond, sharing jokes, developing rhythms. A husband might carve her a comb or bring the first egg from the hens. Such affection was considered a blessing, like a warm spring after hard winter. And if she cried, well, tears could always be dismissed as nerves, excitement, or just womanly frailty. A girl might weep into her sleeve and still be praised for composure, so long as she stood where told and didn't drop the ceremonial bread. Her performance was as much part of the contract as the chickens. She had to be modest but not dull, quiet but not mute, pleasing but not provocative. Every crease in her gown, every misplaced hairpin reflected on her family. Meanwhile, the groom's family inspected her like traders evaluating a plow. Healthy? Broad hips? Clean skin? Can she lift a bucket? Does her laugh sound too sharp? A little wit was fine, but no one wanted a wife who'd argue about how many geese belonged in the barn. Some records include bizarre clauses, brides forbidden from bringing bad dreams or unlucky smells into households. Whether this meant superstition or chronic indigestion remains unclear, but fear of misfortune was ever present. The economics bled into everything. A father might inflate his daughter's desirability by claiming 2 goats and half an acre, omitting that 1 goat was blind and the acre flooded annually. The groom's father would counter by exaggerating his son's inheritance, perhaps conveniently forgetting the land was technically owned by an abbey and choked with nettles. Everyone pretended politely. No one mentioned famine, plague, or failed barley crops. Weddings became brief oases of optimism, wrapped in food, song, and mutual deceit. When the day finally came, the bride walked toward her new life in unfamiliar shoes beside a man whose name she'd only recently learned to spell. That night, as guests stumbled home, her father would exhale over his ale. Another daughter matched, another burden lifted. The deal wasn't sealed in ink, but in bread, boots, and the quiet click of expectations locking into place. Behind the thick walls of monasteries, where the air smelled of candle wax and damp stone, decisions were made with quiet authority. Monks did more than pray and copy manuscripts. They brokered marriages for noble families who valued their discretion, wisdom, and absolute ability to keep secrets. By the 1300s, many aristocratic clans relied on monastic matchmaking services, not for romance, but for cold calculations performed with quill and ink. Bloodlines were traced across parchment like battle strategies. Regional alliances were arranged like mosaic tiles, each piece carefully placed to complete some greater design. A monk with access to family trees and knowledge of recent deaths could determine a girl's future before finishing his morning porridge. Don't imagine these holy men as detached from worldly matters. Many came from noble stock themselves and understood the delicate politics of inheritance. They served as intermediaries, filtering through potential matches with all the sentiment of someone selecting the least rotten apple from a spoiled barrel. Monasteries held the records that made or broke unions: births, baptisms, deaths, previous betrothals. If a girl had been promised to a cousin who later drowned in a pond, the monks remembered. If a groom's aunt had dabbled in heresy 2 decades prior, they noted it. Reputation was currency, and the church kept the ledger. The process was deliberately opaque. Families submitted names and assets through messengers. Negotiations could last weeks or conclude in a single hastily scrawled letter, depending on proximity to war. One monastery famously brokered a marriage between second cousins solely to consolidate a vineyard both families claimed. The bride reportedly adored the wine, if not the groom. It wasn't just monks pulling these strings. Abbesses, especially those ruling powerful convents, wielded tremendous influence. Many noble daughters were sent to nunneries before marriage, not as a religious commitment, but as preparation. There, they learned Latin prayers, embroidery, and the art of keeping silent in authority's presence. Occasionally, they met local lords' sons during feast days. If glances lingered too long, someone took notes. The church's bureaucracy served as matchmaker, lawyer, and judge. Priests ensured couples weren't too closely related, though too close was flexible. Cousin marriages were common, sometimes preferred. The important thing was maintaining the illusion the math worked out. If a union needed hastening due to inheritance disputes or scandal, dispensations could be purchased. One papal document allowed a nobleman to marry his cousin's widow with startling speed after he donated land to an abbey. That land later built a granary. The widow used it to escape her irritating new husband. Some church officials grew entangled in the emotional fallout. Letters survived from abbots expressing concern about reluctant brides or grooms known for drunkenness. These concerns were usually filed away, then ignored. Their existence reveals an uncomfortable truth. Not everyone was blind to the human cost. The church walked a strange line on consent. Technically, both parties had to agree, but a nod or whisper in a field, overheard by a shepherd, could suffice if later sworn under oath. Historians still argue whether this rule protected lovers or simply created convenient paperwork. For convent girls, the transition from potential nun to promised bride was jarring. One week they illuminated psalms. The next, they were fitted for wedding gowns. Decisions came without warning. A letter arrived. A match was confirmed. Some left quietly. Others clawed at their wooden trunks in protest. A few convents allowed a final walk through the herb garden. Not some Edenic paradise, but a patch of rosemary and sage with a coffin-shaped bench. It was a place to say goodbye to silence, to holy discipline, to the illusion of choice. Once the contract sealed, there was no return unless death or scandal intervened. Some convents held small ceremonies marking the transition. A new veil, a different ribbon, a ring from her future family. These gestures were small but heavy with meaning. She was no longer a novice, but a noblewoman. No longer a daughter, but an asset. There might be one moment, walking the convent halls for the last time. where she paused at the chapel, or lingered by the room where she'd whispered fears to another girl after lights out. No dramatic exits, no protests, just the sound of soft shoes on cold stone and the certainty that the door was closing behind her forever. In towns, monks sometimes chaperoned meetings between betrothed couples. These weren't romantic encounters. The pair sat stiffly while a monk droned about grain yields. If anyone blushed, it was blamed on the weather. Yet within these scripted moments, something human occasionally sparked. A shared laugh, a mutual dislike for the priory's terrible fish stew. It wasn't much, but for two people facing a lifetime bound by contract, it was something. Rural priests played matchmaker too, often under pressure. A father might ask his local priest to vet suitors, not for character, but to avoid feuds. Some delayed weddings until pig disputes were settled. Others looked the other way, so long as tithes kept flowing. Once the church blessed the match, its role ended abruptly. The bride passed from ecclesiastical guidance to her husband's rule, and if he was devout, to his personal interpretation of God's will. One imagines monks closing their ledgers with satisfaction. Another match made, another box ticked in the grand scheme of order. But perhaps sometimes, one paused at the chapel window, watching the girl ride away and wondering, just for a heartbeat, what might have happened if she'd stayed. The noble daughter stands motionless, as servants lace her into a gown of stiffened silk, fabric that pretends to be finer than it is. The shoulders pinch, the sleeves itch with dried lavender stuffed inside to mask the scent of nervous sweat. Her shoes, wrapped in cloth against the mud, feel foreign against her feet. She is not walking to her future, she is being walked, escorted down staircases carved by hands dead centuries before her birth. Somewhere below, a horse waits. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a man she's never met prepares for her arrival. Among the nobility, marriage wasn't merely a union. It was living diplomacy, stitched with velvet and land rights. Daughters of powerful houses were traded with the same care reserved for battle maps and royal seals. Beauty helped. Cleverness could be useful. Defiance was managed. Her fate had likely been decided years earlier, perhaps while she still lay in her cradle. These arrangements spanned generations, drawn on parchment by men with ink-stained fingers. Her name wasn't truly hers. It was a bargaining chip in webs of alliance and revenge. Many noble brides traveled hundreds of miles to husbands whose only familiar trait was a crest embroidered on tapestries. She might speak a different dialect, know only rumors. He limps, he collects glass birds, he once rode into battle with his hair on fire. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. The departure ceremony was mercilessly precise. Servants packed trunks with gowns stitched by cousins she'd never see again. A notary read aloud her dowry list. 3 dozen pewter plates, 2 kettles, a side table with a broken leg, bone combs. Not romantic, but practical. Her trousseau was both introduction and armor. Jewelry might be included, not for sentiment, but as proof she came from a house that mattered. A grandmother's clasp, a ring with illegible Latin, talismans against mistreatment. The household lined up to watch her leave. Some wept, others whispered about flooded roads or whether the escort could be trusted. The bride maintained perfect composure. She'd trained for this since age 7. Curtsies practiced before her mother's mirror. At 10, learning to answer without revealing emotion. By 12, understanding her destiny was too important for something as unreliable as desire. The journey itself was an ordeal. Through forests like storybook nightmares, across bridges groaning under generations of travelers. It might take weeks. Sometimes, ladies-in-waiting accompanied her, chosen for their unflappability. Other times, just armed escorts with polished swords and questionable intentions. Weather conspired against them. Rain turned roads to rivers, horses stumbled in darkness, campfires died in the wind. Some brides arrived with frostbitten feet, their boots never adjusted because servants feared delaying the procession. Arrival brought no grand welcome, just gates swinging open, halls filled with strangers. Her husband might be absent, hunting deer or favor at court. His mother might offer a smile tight as a drawn bowstring, wine warm as a winter hearth. She'd be shown to her chamber. The door would close. Letters from her family said nothing of fear or sleeplessness, only duty, unity, and the promise of sons. The household watched her every move. Did she rise early? Speak too quickly? Treat servants with dignity or disdain? Every gesture became brushstrokes on a portrait she didn't paint. Historians note noble marriages were often colder than peasant ones. More at stake, less room for affection. Love wasn't just absent, it was dangerous. Could complicate inheritances, disrupt land transfers. Yet exceptions existed. Matches where respect grew slowly, watered by shared exhaustion with courtly theatrics. Most noble girls found themselves sewn into households like new patches on old tunics, expected to match the pattern without complaining when the seams chafed. Some discovered kindness in their husbands. Others faced cruelty. Many found mere absence. Men physically present but emotionally distant as the falcons they kept. In such houses, wives learned to move like ghosts between chapel and chamber. Multi-wife households bred special tensions. Senior wives saw newcomers as threats regardless of age. The young bride mastered the art of smiling without showing teeth. Her role was clear: bear heirs, manage households, maintain illusions. The household priest might remind her that your womb belongs to God, your time to your husband. She'd nod, though neither statement felt true. Education continued after the wedding: which maids could be trusted, which doors creaked at night, who truly held power, often the steward, not the lord. A misplaced kitchen whisper could echo for years. Letters home were exercises in code. The house is large might mean anything from the walls are cold to I'm drowning here. Her mother would read between the lines and say nothing. Some noble brides staged quiet rebellions, hosting poets, keeping journals hidden under straw mattresses, supporting musicians who sang of freedom. Not protests, survival tactics. Small flames lit where the wind couldn't reach. When pregnancy didn't follow within a year, whispers began. The fault was always hers. She might be told to eat figs, bathe in goat's milk, tuck rosemary under her pillow. If prayers failed, pity curdled to disappointment. A healthy child, preferably a son, brought brief celebration before life resumed. Another mouth to feed, another duty shouldered. The noble girl who once trembled at her father's gate now stood at her own, sleeves no longer scented with lavender, shoes worn thin, voice carefully measured. She'd advise younger girls now, remembering her own arrival. Too many expectations, too few answers. She'd learned what all noble wives did. Marriage wasn't romance or reward, not even partnership. Just a role performed without applause, written by fathers and priests in ink that never quite dried. Yet in walled courtyards, beneath ivy and servant gossip, glances still sometimes strayed where they shouldn't. A promised bride, locking eyes with an unpromised man. No contracts between them, no dowries weighed, no priests rehearsing names. Because for all the medieval marriage market's choreography, love persisted. Inconvenient, unpredictable, and utterly unforgettable. The candlelight flickers across two faces leaning close in the orchard's twilight. She, promised to another. He, unpromised to anyone. Their fingers brush against the rough bark of an apple tree older than their family lineages. This is the medieval marriage market's best-kept secret. For all its rigid choreography, love still found ways to bloom in forbidden spaces. Among nobility, romantic affection was treated like a dangerous fever, something that might burn through reason and duty. Marriage was a contract, a binding of names and acreage. Love belonged to troubadour songs and fools who could afford recklessness. Yet it persisted, in castle corridors between formal audiences, in monastery gardens during supervised visits, in the hedgerows where village girls met miller's sons. The records whisper of couples who dared more. A baron's daughter and her Latin tutor, vanishing under cover of night with forged documents, living nearly a year in hiding before being discovered. The tutor hanged, the girl walled up in a convent, her steady handwriting later described as sorrowful in the margins of copied psalms. A merchant's daughter caught exchanging letters with a journeyman. The parchment scraps found and burned. The girl married within the month to a widower 3 times her age, who complained she smelled of ink and rebellion. Peasant communities sometimes tolerated affection's role in matchmaking. A daughter might marry the thatcher's son she fancied, provided his family owned decent pasture land. Young couples could steal moments at harvest festivals, exchange token gifts under watchful eyes. But even here, strategic needs trumped personal preference. The girl who loved the charcoal burner's boy would still be marched to the cooper's apprentice if her father had promised her first. The church's stance created delicious contradictions. Clandestine marriages, private vows exchanged without witnesses, were technically binding. A couple could swear themselves married in a field, a barn, by a moonlit well, and canon law might recognize it. This loophole became both weapon and trap. Some girls used it to claim marriages to preferred suitors. Others were coerced into unions based on misheard promises. One heartbreaking case tells of a servant girl who pretended marriage to a passing soldier to avoid the cloister. When the soldier denied knowing her, she was shamed publicly before being wed to a one-toothed widower with 3 daughters. Her surviving journal contains recipes interspersed with poetry about longing and garlic. The merchant class walked a tightrope, allowing supervised courtship but crushing spontaneity. Families arranged chance meetings at church or markets, giving illusion of choice while maintaining control. Love songs from this period survive like smuggled treasures. I would trade your father's orchard for a look. One ballad pleads, wear your name before your ring. Troubadours capitalized on this tension, traveling between courts, singing of knights who defied kings for love. Ladies who wept into fountains over choices never given. The irony was thick enough to cut with a dagger. The same nobles who hired these musicians often enforced the very marriages that left daughters weeping into their tapestries. Occasionally, miraculously, love and arrangement aligned. 2 families agreed, and the children happened to cherish each other. These unions were celebrated as divine will made manifest, the exception that proved the mercenary rule. More often, affection arrived late, or not at all. Some couples built quiet companionship through shared hardship. Others lived parallel lives in the same household. He to his accounts and hunting, she to her still room and children. The luckiest found solace in stolen moments. A daydream while weaving, a lingering glance at a visiting night, a lullaby hummed in a childhood dialect. The records preserve these fragile rebellions. not in official documents, but in marginalia, recipe notes, the patterns of embroidery. A countess's psalter contains doodled hearts beside Psalm 137. A merchant's ledger has a sonnet scrawled between tax entries. These weren't declarations meant to change the world, but proof that even in the most rigid systems, hearts kept their stubborn rhythm. Because in the end, the medieval marriage market with all its contracts and inspections couldn't entirely stamp out the human need to choose, to connect, to love. It tried mightily, with laws and threats and carefully weighed silver. But in moonlit orchards and behind chapel doors, in the space between a breath and a vow, love persisted. Not because it was permitted, but because it refused to be forgotten. The saddest part? Most of these stories didn't end with grand gestures or happy resolutions. The baron's daughter really did spend her life copying texts. The merchant's bride likely learned to stomach her husband's breath. But the fact that they left any record at all, a doodle, a song, a single line in a chronicle about a girl who wept so piteously the scribe could scarce continue, tells us everything. For every 1,000 matches made for land or money or peace treaties, there was someone who looked at another person and thought, you, against everything, you. And sometimes, against all odds, they found ways to carve that truth into the margins of history. The wax seal cracks like a tiny bone as the servant presses the family crest into molten red. Outside, a horse stamps impatiently, not waiting for the bride this time, but for the letter confirming her obedience. This is marriage by proxy, where bodies need not be present for lives to be irrevocably bound. Among nobility, proxy marriages solved inconvenient logistics, war, travel, or simple reluctance to attend one's own wedding. A stand-in groom, often a brother or uncle, would recite vows while the real husband campaigned in France or hunted in Burgundy. The bride's response wasn't truly hers, just words memorized under her mother's watchful eye. The ceremony had all the romance of a property deed signing, which essentially it was. Some brides didn't meet their husbands for months or even years after the legal union. One poor girl was married by proxy to a garrison commander who, upon returning, mistook her for a servant and demanded wine directions. She deliberately sent him to the wrong cellar. Portraits served as poor substitutes for grooms. Small painted panels carried like religious icons. Accuracy varied wildly. One Italian noblewoman fainted upon meeting her husband, having expected the auburn-haired poet in the miniature, and finding instead a bald warlord with a scarred jaw and a habit of shouting during meals. Tokens replaced people with depressing regularity: a ring, a glove, a lace kerchief to be worn publicly as proof of commitment. One German bride slept with her proxy's dagger under her pillow for 6 months until her real husband arrived. When he finally did, she reportedly asked if he wanted the dagger back. Ratification ceremonies provided farcical second weddings when absent grooms finally appeared. By then, the marriage was already legally binding. This was just performance. Imagine standing before your new husband, knowing his name has already replaced yours in all documents, his coat of arms sewn into your bed curtains, your body legally his before you'd even seen his face. Some proxy brides became accidental rulers in their husbands' prolonged absences. A French girl married at 14 to a crusader managed his estates for 7 years before he returned, only to die of dysentery 3 weeks later. She promptly married his younger brother and continued governing. The cruelty lay in the details. One Burgundian contract specified the bride mustn't grow overfond of the proxy. Another required monthly letters to her absent husband, to be inspected by his mother first. The few surviving replies are masterpieces of double meaning. The weather continues fair could mean anything from contentment to suicidal despair. Not all proxy marriages were grim. One Scottish heiress reportedly adored her stand-in groom, her husband's charming younger brother, so much that when the real husband returned, all three lived contentedly together. The church pretended not to notice. Peasants used proxy shortcuts too, a brother representing a groom working distant fields, bringing bread and wine to sanctify the rushed ceremony. These unions were practical rather than political. Nobody cared if you married your sweetheart by creek or candlelight, so long as the harvest got brought in. The saddest proxies were the posthumous ones, girls married to already dead men to secure inheritances. One Spanish bride performed her vows beside her groom's coffin, then retired to a convent with his family name and a pension. She was 13. What these ghost marriages revealed was the market's ultimate truth. Flesh and feeling were secondary. The contract came first, the sacrament a distant second, and the people involved a mere afterthought. A bride could be wife, widow, and virgin simultaneously. Her body untouched, but her future already written in ink that wouldn't fade. Some women adapted, finding unexpected power in the gaps. The French estate ruler, the German bride with her dagger, the Scottish trio who outmaneuvered convention. They discovered what all survivors of arranged marriages learned eventually, that even in the most rigid systems, cracks existed where a clever woman might carve out space to breathe. Most just endured. They learned their husband's language, his family's rituals, which topics to avoid. They memorized the sound of his breathing at night, sometimes the first intimate knowledge they had of the stranger in their bed. And when the system worked as intended, when proxy became person, when portrait gave way to flesh, when the contract's ink dried and daily life began. That was when the real marriage started. Not with a kiss or a vow, but with the quiet, terrible realization that this was now the rest of her life. The priest squints at his manuscript, mumbling Latin words that taste like dust on his tongue. Between them stands a shoe and a belt. The bride's offering and the groom's, objects that will bind them more permanently than any vow. This is marriage stripped to its barest bones. No flowers, no music, just the smell of wax and wool and the quiet desperation of two people performing a ritual they barely understand. In the 1300s, wedding ceremonies ranged from cathedral spectacles to fieldside handshakes. The church provided structure, but people clung to older symbols. A ring if possible, but often just whatever tangible object could represent union. A braided circle of hair, a twisted straw band, even a shared loaf of bread torn with dirty hands. The important thing wasn't elegance, but clarity. Witnesses, intention, and something, anything, passing between hands to mark the transition. Regional customs varied wildly. Some brides handed over shoes to symbolize transferred authority. Grooms offered belts representing shared burdens. Practical items turned sacred through necessity. In Brittany, couples lit candles from the same flame. In Lombardy, they bound wrists with ribbons that would later swaddle their firstborn. Church ceremonies could be shockingly perfunctory. A bored priest stumbling through rites, guests coughing in damp wool, the couple themselves repeating lines like poorly rehearsed actors. Rural weddings often unfolded where life did. In courtyards, between fields, at the foot of staircases where both families could argue about sheep while pretending to listen. One bizarre but widespread tradition required brides to carry salt, whether to ward off evil, preserve the union, or simply season the inevitably bland wedding feast. No chronicler could agree. Contracts specifically mentioned it, along with livestock and linens. Imagine standing at the altar, your future hanging in the balance, and some great aunt hissing, "Don't forget the salt." Vows themselves were often shockingly simple. I take these sufficed in most villages. Noble brides might recite longer scripts, but even these were learned by rote, like children memorizing prayers they couldn't comprehend. The groom's performance was equally constrained. Too much smiling seemed mocking, too little suggested reluctance. There was precisely one acceptable facial expression: solemn willingness. Noble weddings layered on pageantry. Multiple priests, choirs, banners announcing the bride's pedigree. She might kneel to receive a symbolic key to the household, a charming fiction, given that most decisions would remain far beyond her control. Music played on simple pipes and lutes, the lyrics telling of duty and cautious hope. One surviving song contains the devastating couplet, "I shall bear what you cannot carry. You shall own what I may not keep." Gifts reflected this dissonance. A bride might receive a jeweled brooch alongside a goat, a tapestry with a wooden spoon shaped like a fish. One record dryly notes a groom's family gifting 12 silver plates and one temperamental mule. The symbolism was lost even to contemporaries. Then came the feast, or what passed for one. Peasants shared coarse bread and onions. Nobles gorged on spiced wine and peacocks stuffed with quail eggs. But everyone understood this wasn't the end, just the prelude to the real test. As guests stumbled home, the couple faced the expectation of consummation. Among nobles, this meant witnesses, discreetly positioned, of course, to confirm the deed was done. Beds inspected, sheets checked for blood, stories whispered. Villagers were less formal, but no less expectant. The community had seen the vows. Now, they wanted results. A child within the year sealed the contract more firmly than any signature. Yet within this pressure cooker of ritual, human moments persisted. The groom who forgot which hand the ring belonged on. The bride who sneezed during her vows. The candle that refused to stay lit no matter how many times the priest relit it. These unscripted flaws, rarely written down but endlessly retold, became the real memories, the stories shared at later gatherings with laughter and ale. Because beneath the pageantry, these were real people. Flawed, frightened, standing in shoes that pinched, speaking words they barely understood, holding hands with virtual strangers they now had to trust. The rituals were symbolic, but the fear was achingly genuine. And somehow, through the awkwardness and discomfort, life began. Not perfect life, not happy life, but life nonetheless, with all its compromises and quiet victories. A shared joke over burnt porridge, an unexpected kindness during illness. The gradual realization that the stranger beside you might, against all odds, become someone you could endure. Because that was the true medieval marriage sacrament. Not the grand ceremony or the legal contract, but the daily choice to bend without breaking. To find inches of warmth in a world that measured love in acres and livestock. To wake each morning and decide, again, to continue. The couple in our story, the one with the shoe and the belt, will likely forget most of their wedding day. The mumbled Latin, the priest's bad breath, the way the belt's buckle left a crescent mark on the bride's palm. But years later, when their first grandchild asks how they met, they might share a glance, just for a heartbeat, before launching into the approved story about dowries and agreements. And that glance, that silent understanding between them, will be the real ceremony. The one no priest witnessed, no contract recorded, but which mattered more than all the rest combined. The wind carries the scent of crushed grass as two figures stand in the twilight. No priest, no witnesses, just whispered words that might or might not count as marriage. This was the church's worst nightmare and love's greatest loophole. Clandestine unions, where a promise made in a field could override years of careful negotiation. Canon law was clear. Marriage required only mutual consent. No witnesses, no ceremony, just two people exchanging vows with intent. This radical idea created chaos in the carefully ordered marriage market. Couples could, and did, swear themselves married in barns, by wells, under elder trees after dark. If challenged, they'd insist before ecclesiastical courts that their private promises were binding. Some succeeded. Most faced brutal consequences. The records overflow with these desperate cases. A miller's daughter claiming she married a shepherd near the Standing Stones. A squire and a merchant's niece exchanging rings in an apple orchard. A widow and a tanner pledging themselves beside a stream, witnessed only by frogs. The church hated these unions, but couldn't outright deny them. After all, wasn't free consent the foundation of sacramental marriage? So they fought back with bureaucracy. By the late 1300s, councils demanded public vows, multiple witnesses, and priestly blessings. But rural communities resisted. Why pay for a church ceremony when the creek bank worked just as well? Why involve parents when young love had already spoken? The results were often tragic. A girl could declare herself married to avoid an arranged match, only to have her father drag her before the bishop demanding annulment. A man might swear vows in passion, then deny them when a richer match appeared. The worst cases involved pregnancy. Without proof of marriage, the woman bore all consequences. One heartrending deposition describes a servant girl presenting a willow ring as evidence of her marriage. The court dismissed it as women's folly. Yet for all the risks, clandestine marriages kept happening because they offered something rare in medieval life. Choice. Not freedom exactly, but the illusion of it for one stolen moment. The miller's daughter really did love that shepherd. The widow found solace with the gentle tanner. Their methods were desperate because their alternatives were worse. Some victories shine through the records. A Yorkshire farmer's son who married his sweetheart in a secret midnight ceremony at the smithy. Their descendants still farm that land today. A Norman noblewoman who outmaneuvered her family by accidentally getting witnessed, exchanging vows with her preferred suitor behind the chapel. When confronted, she smiled sweetly and said, "God heard us first." The church's tortured stance revealed its own contradictions. Consent mattered. Unless it undermined social order, vows were sacred. Unless they threatened property rights. This tension created bizarre hybrid practices. Some villages required couples to announce intentions 3 Sundays running. If no one objected, the union could proceed. Others accepted daylight vows more readily than nighttime ones. The true casualties were the vulnerable. Girls coerced into marriages that wealthy boys later denied. Servants pressured by masters claiming a whispered promise nullified consent. The law tried patching these holes, but justice moved slower than desire. Yet even the failed attempts left marks. A song from Poitiers tells of lovers who carved their names into an oak that outlasted both their families. A Scottish ballad describes a widow placing 2 intertwined rings in her husband's coffin, one for his official bride, one for the woman he'd loved in secret. These fragments suggest something revolutionary, that medieval people understood the difference between marriage as institution and marriage as choice. They navigated both, sometimes simultaneously, with all the hypocrisy and hope that required. The system's ultimate irony? Many clandestine marriages probably involved the same pragmatic calculations as arranged ones, just self-arranged. The farmer's son likely chose a bride who could churn butter efficiently, the noblewoman still married within her class. But the illusion of agency mattered. The mere possibility that someone, somewhere, might choose transform the entire oppressive structure. Because in the end, the church's inability to fully control marriage created cracks where light got in. Not enough to dismantle the system, but sufficient to remind everyone that hearts beat beneath the contracts. That sometimes, not often, but sometimes, love could find a way. As our couple in the field knows, their vows may not hold up in court. The bishop may annul them, their families punish them, the community shun them. But tonight, with the grass whispering around them and the first stars appearing, none of that matters. For this moment, they are precisely what they say they are, husband and wife. And no law, no ledger, no angry father can change that truth. Because the medieval marriage market could dictate unions, control property, and measure dowries down to the last chicken. But it could never entirely rule the human heart. And that was its fatal flaw. The black veil swallows the girl's face whole, its musty folds smelling of someone else's lavender and grief. At 14, she's already a widow, the shortest marriage in village memory. Before the month ends, someone will ask about remarriage. In the medieval world, widowhood wasn't an ending, just an inconvenient pause in the great marital carousel. Death harvested husbands with grim efficiency. War, plague, farming accidents, suspicious tavern brawls. Girls married at 12 could be widowed by 13, and betrothed again before fully memorizing their first husband's name. For noble families, this recycling was routine. A young widow retained value, her dowry already invested, her fertility presumed intact. No children? Easily remarried? A son? She'd stay as steward until he came of age, then be traded again. The rituals of mourning were strictly performative. Black or gray gowns for precisely 40 days in some regions, 3 months in others. Just enough time to weep, but not too loudly, pray, but not excessively, and demonstrate proper grief before the next candidate appeared. One French widow was informed of her remarriage during her husband's wake. The contract signed before his body cooled. Peasants moved faster. Hunger didn't wait for decorum. A widow with children to feed might remarry within weeks. The negotiations conducted over the same bread and ale that fueled all village business. These were partnerships of pure necessity. Two exhausted people combining resources, often with as much romance as yoking oxen together. Widowhood's cruelest joke was its fleeting autonomy. With no living husband or son, a woman could briefly control property, make legal decisions, even refuse remarriage, if her family allowed it. But this freedom was fragile as April ice. A wealthier relative, a debt owed, a strategic alliance could smash it overnight. Most widows were back under male authority before their mourning veils were laundered. Convents became refugees for those who could afford them, not out of piety, but pragmatism. Behind those walls, a widow might become a librarian, healer, or teacher. One Italian noblewoman famously took vows just to keep her late husband's lands from greedy cousins. Her religious calling miraculously faded when the threat passed. The records preserve heartbreaking fragments of resistance. A Breton widow who postponed 6 marriages by claiming omens and feigned illnesses until granted land and falcons. A German woman who kept her first husband's ring, sewn into all subsequent wedding gowns. The English peasant who taught her grandchildren lullabies in her dead husband's dialect, though her new spouse forbade it, but most complied because survival demanded it. They learned new names, new households, new marital expectations, with the weary adaptability of people who understood the rules. The girl who once trembled at her first wedding now stood steadier at her second, not from happiness, but experience. She knew where the shadows fell in a strange house. She understood how to arrange feasts and soothe bruises. She'd lost illusions, but gained knowledge. And in a world where knowledge was power, that was no small thing. Because widowhood revealed the market's ultimate truth. Women were renewable resources in the medieval economy. Their bodies, their labor, their childbearing capacity could be transferred indefinitely until death or decrepitude removed them from circulation. The same church that preached "till death do us part" happily blessed second and third unions when property required it. Yet in this ruthless system, some women found unexpected leverage. The widow who managed to keep her dower rights became a player rather than a pawn. The one who turned multiple marriages into a network of influence. The peasant who used remarriage to improve her children's prospects. They weren't rebels. They were survivors who learned to bend the rules just enough to breathe. As our girl in the oversized veil knows, the mourning period will end. The offers will come. She'll be reminded that God tested you and found you strong, that life is short, that the best way to honor his memory is to smile for the next one. And she'll likely obey, because what choice is there? But perhaps, in some quiet moment before dawn, she'll press her face into that musty black fabric and weep for herself rather than the dead. Not for the husband she lost, but for the girl she was before this endless cycle began. The one who still believed marriage might be more than a transaction. The one who didn't yet understand that in the medieval world, widowhood wasn't an escape. Just a reset before the next round began. The firelight dances across the mother's calloused hands as she kneads the dough with practiced motions, her daughter watching silently. This is where medieval marriages were truly made. Not in grand halls with sealed contracts, but in cramped cottages where women passed down unspoken truths like heirlooms. The girl's future is being measured out in handfuls of flour and carefully timed silences. In peasant households, marriage negotiations lacked heralds and parchment, but carried equal weight. A good match could mean meat in the winter stew. A bad one might doom the family to hunger. Every glance at the grain stores, every calculation about livestock, was also a calculation about daughters. The mother becomes both strategist and scribe, remembering which neighbor's son has gentle hands, which family hides their drunken patriarch well, whose daughters-in-law mysteriously perish in childbirth too often. The education begins early. At 7, the girl learns to braid her hair tighter. At 10, she's warned away from the well when certain boys linger. By 12, she understands her body as currency. Her strong arms for lifting buckets, her straight teeth, her ability to churn butter without complaint. These lessons aren't cruel. They're survival skills in a world that won't bend for female weakness. Fathers negotiate with blunt tools, land, livestock, reputation. A son who thatches well is worth more than one with a lazy stride. A daughter who makes excellent cheese and keeps peace in a crowded home is a prize beyond silver. No one says this aloud, but everyone measures it. The glance at a girl's wrists as she sweeps, the appraisal of her posture at church, When prospects emerge, the dance begins. Not with flowers or poetry, but with bread loaves left on doorsteps, strategic seating at mass, a boy happening to walk her home. The village watches, judges, remembers. A broken courtship could brand a girl for years. A successful one might still collapse over missing pigs or a disputed fence line. The wedding itself is modest. A priest's blessing, if they're lucky, often just a hand-fasting with woven cords. Gifts are practical: a kettle, a fleece, an extra hour of help during planning. The feast is whatever the community can spare. Bread, onions, perhaps a scrawny chicken. There's laughter, but it's edged with relief. Tomorrow, the real work begins. The bride moves into her husband's household, a crowded space of parents, siblings, aunts, all watching her every move. Privacy is non-existent. Respect must be earned through labor. Dawn comes with chores, dusk with aching backs. There are disputes over milk yields, suspicions about stolen eggs, the constant press of bodies in tight spaces. Yet within this hardness, softness persists. The mother-in-law who secretly saves her the first cream. The husband who brings wild strawberries because she once mentioned liking them. The sister-in-law who teaches her the family's secret remedy for colic. These small kindnesses are lifelines. Not all peasant marriages are arranged. Some grow from childhood proximity. The boy and girl who tended sheep together. The harvest partners who found comfort in familiarity. Even then, permission is required. A smile isn't enough. Promises must be witnessed, approved, sanctified. The rules bind rich and poor alike. What emerges is a paradox. Marriages forged in pragmatism sometimes kindle unexpected tenderness. The couple who learns each other through shared labor rather than courtly games. The woman who finds authority in motherhood after a joyless wedding. The man who discovers his wife's sharp wit is an asset rather than a threat. The mother in our story knows this truth. As she shapes the dough, she's also shaping her daughter's understanding, not of love, that luxury is for ballads, but of endurance. How to bend without breaking. How to find pockets of joy and obligation. How to survive in a world that views her as both essential and expendable. Because peasant marriage isn't about hearts or land. It's about the daily negotiation between need and hope. Between what must be borne and what might, against all odds, become bearable. Between the life she was given and the life she slowly, stubbornly makes her own. And when the bread comes out of the oven, neither burnt nor perfect, but edible, sustaining, the daughter will understand this too. That marriage, like bread, requires both recipe and resilience. That some loves are built rather than born. That in this candlelit world of compromise and quiet courage, that might just be enough. The father's boots leave angry imprints in the damp earth as he paces. Each step a silent accusation. The mother stands frozen at the window, her fingers leaving ghostly marks on the frosted glass. Their daughter's bed lies empty, her winter cloak missing. In the medieval marriage market's carefully ordered world, someone has dared to run. Elopements were the system's bleeding wound, rare enough to shock, frequent enough to haunt every negotiation. They happened for every imaginable reason. A girl terrified of her betrothed's rumored cruelty. A boy refusing the wealthy bride his father chose. Two childhood sweethearts gambling on forbidden vows. Their methods were equally varied. Stolen horses, bribed ferrymen, forged documents, or simply slipping away during market day chaos. The church's own rules facilitated these escapes. That radical idea of consent meant clandestine marriages held legal weight. A couple could wed themselves under an oak tree at midnight, and if they spoke the right words with intent, God, and eventually some courts, might recognize what families denied. Some succeeded spectacularly. A Flemish wool merchant's daughter and her minstrel lover fled to Scotland, where her skill with accounts earned them a tavern that became legendary for its music. A knight's second son married his lord's daughter in a stable ceremony, then presented the fait accompli with such charm that both families eventually pretended it had been their idea. More often, the endings were grim. The miller's son and the baker's daughter caught at a roadside inn, their defiant letters burned before their eyes. The noble girl dragged back from her scholar lover's cottage, her hair shorn as punishment. The peasant couple who drowned together rather than be separated, their bodies found with woven grass rings still on their fingers. The consequences rippled far beyond the lovers themselves. A failed elopement could bankrupt families through forfeited dowries. It might ignite feuds lasting generations. For the runners, even success came at cost. Exile from home parishes, perpetual suspicion, the loss of everything familiar. Yet still they ran, because in a world where marriages were brokered over livestock disputes and political alliances, elopement was the one defiant act that shouted, "This body is mine," however briefly, however foolishly. The records preserve heartbreaking fragments, a love note hidden in a prayer book. Meet me where the stream turns west. Bring only your courage. A deposition from a stable boy who witnessed two servants exchanging vows over a stolen loaf. They fed each other crumbs like it was communion. A song about a widow and a shepherd who carved their names into a standing stone, the groove still visible decades later. Communities responded with equal parts cruelty and complicity. Some neighbors turned blind eyes to midnight footsteps. Others joined the hunt with pitchforks. A Yorkshire village famously sheltered an eloping pair for 3 winters before the bishop found out. A Norman town still tells of the baker who left his back door unlocked every midsummer eve, just in case. The nobility reacted with particular fury. A runaway daughter could undo years of political maneuvering. One Italian countess was walled up in a tower for 5 years after her attempted flight. Her only company, the troubadour whose songs had inspired her, imprisoned in the cell below. They communicated through rainwater pipes until he died of fever. But the greatest punishment was often the marriage itself. Many captured runaways were forcibly wed to their original betrothed, a lifelong reminder that rebellion changed nothing. The German chronicler Gottfried of Alsace tells of one such bride who, at her wedding feast, methodically ate every flower arrangement until sick. Her new husband reportedly found this amusing. Yet even in failure, these stories mattered. They became ballads whispered at spinning wheels, jokes traded in taverns, warnings muttered by mothers to daughters, proof that the system wasn't invincible, that someone, somewhere, had tried to choose. As for our missing girl, the one whose empty bed mocks her parents, history doesn't record her fate. Perhaps she's crouched in a charcoal burner's hut, listening for hounds. Maybe she's already been caught, her defiance becoming just another cautionary tale. But in some alternate version of events, she's standing in a dusty churchyard at dawn, gripping her lover's hand as a sleepy priest mumbles the Latin. The words don't matter. The witnesses don't matter. What matters is the look they exchange when the priest says, "You may kiss." Not a perfect romance, not a happy ending, but a moment of pure stolen agency. Because in the end, that was the medieval marriage market's deepest fear. Not the loss of control, but the revelation that control had always been an illusion. That hearts could slip through the tightest nets. That sometimes, against all odds, love refused to follow the rules. And so the market tightened its grip. More contracts, more witnesses, harsher punishments. But it could never quite stamp out the truth whispered by every runaway's footsteps. That no system is airtight. That not all cages are locked. That somewhere beyond the carefully drawn boundaries of duty and custom, there might just exist a life worth risking everything for. The ship's deck rolls beneath her feet as the coastline shrinks to a gray smudge. Salt spray stings her eyes, or perhaps it's tears. She'll never admit which. This is the final brutal truth of the medieval marriage market. Some girls weren't just traded between families, but between languages, cultures, entire worlds. Foreign brides were diplomacy's living chess pieces. A French princess sent to Castile to seal a truce, a German noblewoman shipped to Hungary to secure trade routes, a Byzantine heiress dispatched to Normandy as part of some forgotten treaty. Their value lay precisely in their alienness, their ability to straddle 2 worlds while never fully belonging to either. The adjustment was a special kind of torture. Imagine arriving at a castle where even the servants smirk at your accent, where the spices in your wedding feast make you ill, where your carefully rehearsed curtsy is suddenly too deep or not deep enough. One Flemish bride in England was mocked for months because her pronunciation of bread sounded like breast. Another in Sweden nearly caused a diplomatic incident by refusing to eat pickled herring on Fridays. Language barriers cut deepest. A 12-year-old Bohemian girl married to an Italian count reportedly didn't speak for her first year abroad. Not from defiance, but because no one bothered to teach her the words. Her letters home, written phonetically by a sympathetic scribe, contain heartbreaking attempts to describe loneliness without vocabulary for it. The stone feels heavy in my chest when the bells ring at night. Smart brides turned their foreignness into power. A Navarrese princess in Aquitaine became indispensable by negotiating with Basque wool traders in their native tongue. A Danish girl married into Scotland charmed her way into influence by translating her husband's gruff demands into poetic compliments. They were exceptions, most simply endured the slow erosion of self that came with assimilation. The church encouraged these unions while doing nothing to ease their brutality. Priests assured foreign brides that God's love transcends all tongues, even as they refused to perform Mass in the woman's native language. A Polish duchess in Bavaria famously smuggled in a priest from home, hiding him in her chambers to hear confession in her mother tongue, until her husband's chaplain discovered them and accused her of witchcraft. Peasant brides faced equal trials with fewer resources. A Breton girl married to a Gascon farmer might spend years communicating through gestures and badly pronounced nouns. Their children would become fluent in both cultures while she remained suspended between them, never quite mastering the new, never entirely losing the old. Some clung to home through objects, a particular herb grown in secret gardens, a prayer book in forbidden script, a recipe stubbornly prepared despite the household's complaints. A Sicilian woman in Normandy was mocked for adding garlic to everything, until a plague outbreak left her kitchen the only one unaffected. Suddenly, everyone wanted her foreign magic. The cruelest joke? These women's entire value lay in their bloodlines, yet their children would erase them. Sons spoke their father's language. Daughters adopted their husband's customs. Within generations, the foreign bride's origins became mere footnotes in family chronicles, if that. Yet traces remained. A Welsh lullaby hummed in an English nursery. a distinctive stitch in Hungarian embroidery said to come from an Armenian grandmother, the stubborn persistence of garlic in Norman cooking. These were their true legacies, not treaties or alliances, but the quiet, unkillable fragments of identity they smuggled into new worlds. Our girl on the ship doesn't know this yet. She only knows the deck's pitch matches the sinking in her stomach. That the woman on the dock, her new mother-in-law, already frowns at how she grips the railing. That nothing in her 17 years has prepared her for this moment. But history suggests she'll survive. She'll learn to smile at jokes she doesn't understand, to swallow foods that revolt her, to pray in a language that once felt sacred, but now just feels strange. She'll bear children who consider her homeland some exotic fable. And someday, decades hence, when a granddaughter asks about that odd song she hums while spinning, she'll smile a secret smile and say, "That's from a place I knew once, a place you'll never see." Because that was the final paradox of the medieval marriage market. It could move bodies across continents, but never quite transplant hearts. The girl who boarded the ship will become a woman who belongs nowhere. But in that dislocation, she'll find a kind of freedom, the freedom to carry her homeland unburdened by geography, to be the only one who remembers what was lost and what was gained. And when she dies, in a bed far from where she was born, surrounded by descendants who speak a different tongue, her last thought might just be of her mother's voice, calling her home for supper in words no one around her now would understand. A private ending to a very public life, the medieval marriage market's last unclaimed victory. Because in the end, every foreign bride was two people, the one the world saw and the one who remembered. And not even the most carefully constructed alliance could bridge that divide. The examination room smells of vinegar and dried herbs, scents meant to mask more unpleasant odors. The girl stands motionless as the physician's cold fingers probe her scalp, counting lice like coins. This is the medieval marriage market's most dehumanizing ritual, the bridal inspection, where young women became livestock assessed for breeding potential. Noble families conducted these evaluations with clinical precision. A prospective bride might be paraded through hall after hall like a prize mare at auction, made to walk, sit, even sing to demonstrate her health. Physicians check teeth for discoloration, hips for childbearing width, skin for the telltale blemishes that might indicate disease. One Italian contract famously required the bride to be weighed against sacks of grain, 3 sacks being deemed acceptable. The criteria bordered on absurd. A German countess rejected a potential daughter-in-law for having overly moist hands. A French nobleman demanded his son's bride spend a full day in the kitchens to test her stamina. The worst were the group inspections, like the notorious 1327 case, where 6 Burgundian noblemen collectively evaluated a 15-year-old's physique under the guise of assessing her pious demeanor. Peasant inspections were less formal, but equally brutal. Village midwives might examine a girl's teeth and posture at the market. Fathers discreetly inquired about menstrual regularity. A single rumor of weak hips or fainting spells could destroy marriage prospects overnight. Teeth became obsessive focal points. Straight, white ones, suggesting health and good breeding. Contracts specifically mentioned dental condition. Some brides were made to bite into apples before witnesses to prove their chewing efficiency. One unfortunate English girl had her marriage canceled because her canine teeth were deemed too pointed, giving her a wolfish aspect. Virginity tests, though scientifically meaningless, were performed with solemn pseudoscience. Midwives examined hymenal tissue, despite medieval medicine's vague understanding of female anatomy, checked for loose hips, even interpreted dreams. A Bohemian bride was nearly rejected because she dreamed of running water the night before her inspection, taken as a sign of sexual restlessness. The psychological toll was immense. Girls developed nervous tics from constant scrutiny, a chronic blink, a habitual lip bite. Some starved themselves to achieve the slender-waisted ideal, others force-fed to suggest fertility. A heartbreaking account from a French convent describes a 12-year-old practicing facial expressions for hours. The meek look, the fertile look, the look that says you're innocent but not simple. Yet some turned the inspection into a weapon. The quick-witted Norman girl who, when asked to demonstrate her teeth, bit the inspecting bishop's finger. The merchant's daughter who deliberately spilled wine on herself to avoid being weighed. Their small rebellions rarely changed outcomes, but became legendary among other women. The cruelest twist? These inspections never truly ended. After marriage, a woman's body remained community property. Her pregnancy progress discussed at market, her milk production analyzed by in-laws, her aging face compared to younger rivals. The bride who passed inspection at 15 might be failed by 30, replaced by some fresher model. Our girl in the examination room endures it all. The prodding, the notes being taken, the way the physician sniffs after checking her hair. She knows the rules. No flinching, no complaints, no questions. When they comment on her narrow hips, she doesn't point out that her mother bore 8 children with similar bones. When they criticize her pale complexion, she doesn't mention the sleepless nights spent dreading this moment. Because that's the inspection's unspoken purpose. To break her before the marriage even begins. To teach her that her body isn't hers. That her comfort doesn't matter. That her value lies in parts rather than the whole. Yet, as they lead her away, something shifts in her posture. A slight straightening of the spine, a barely perceptible tightening at the corners of her eyes. It's not defiance, not yet, but the seed of something dangerous. The realization that she survived the humiliation, that whatever comes next, she's stronger than they think. And perhaps years later, when she's a mother arranging her own daughter's inspection, she'll pause just before entering the chamber. Maybe she'll adjust the girl's collar in a way that says, "I know." Or perhaps she'll simply comply, proving the system's most devastating lesson, that nothing perpetuates cruelty like survived trauma. Because the medieval marriage market didn't just trade flesh, it traded dignity. And the currency always came due. The first light of dawn creeps across the cottage floor, illuminating the young mother's exhausted face as she rocks her newborn. This is where all the contracts and inspections and negotiations ultimately lead. To this quiet, blood-stained moment where theory becomes flesh. The medieval marriage market's grand designs always ended at the childbed, where women paid the ultimate price for men's political games. Childbirth was the crucible that tested every marital calculation. That promising hip width, inspected so clinically, now meant life or death. The fertile appearance praised at market could doom a girl to 10 pregnancies in 12 years. Noble or peasant, every bride eventually faced this truth. Her primary value lay in what might kill her. Midwives carried generations of hard-won knowledge, herbs to ease pain, tricks for breech births, prayers that sounded like spells. But their tools were woefully inadequate against hemorrhage, infection, or the merciless mathematics of narrow pelvises and large babies. The wealthiest families hired physicians, though their help often proved fatal. Men who'd never seen a birth insisting on bleeding laboring women or administering strengthening elixirs of mercury and crushed pearls. The statistics still horrify. 1 in 3 medieval women died in childbed. Graveyards are full of shared headstones. Wife of X perished in childbirth, aged 16. Yet the system demanded they keep trying. A French noblewoman famously bore 12 children in 13 years before finally succumbing. Her husband's memorial inscription praised her dutiful fertility. Postpartum was its own gauntlet. Peasant women returned to field work within days. Noble women faced the equally dangerous politics of producing heirs. Failure to conceive quickly brought scrutiny. Was she cold? Had she angered God? One English queen was forced to undergo humiliating public baths in fertility waters after 2 childless years. Yet within this brutality, women forged quiet networks of survival. Mothers-in-law who'd once been critical became allies, sharing secret remedies. Village women took turns nursing each other's babies when milk ran dry. A remarkable set of letters between German noble sisters reveals a whole underground economy of childbirth tips, from placing rosemary under the mattress, to which saints responded fastest to desperate prayers. The babies themselves were both blessing and burden. Every healthy birth secured a woman's position. Every stillborn chipped at it. Sons brought celebration, but also pressure to produce spares. Daughters faced their own grim futures in the marriage market. And through it all, the relentless cycle continued. Conception, pregnancy, birth, repeat. Some women found ways to resist. The peasant girl who pretended miscarriage to space out pregnancies. The duchess who bribed her confessor to declare periods of religious abstinence. Their methods were desperate because the stakes were ultimate. Not just comfort, but survival. Our exhausted new mother knows this as she counts her newborn's fingers. The negotiations that led here, the inspections she endured, the contract that now binds her to this tiny, squalling life. None of it matters in this raw moment. All that exists is the terrifying love already tightening around her heart, and the dawning realization that she would die for this child. Perhaps that was the medieval marriage market's greatest miscalculation. It assumed women could be reduced to reproductive vessels. But in the shadowy space between birth and death, something unexpected flourished. A fierceness no contract could capture. A loyalty no political alliance could break. As the sun rises fully, painting the bloody linens in gold light, the baby finally latches. The mother leans back against the wall, her tears cutting tracks through days-old sweat. Outside, the village stirs. Another ordinary morning where extraordinary courage goes unremarked. Because this is how the system truly functioned. On the silent strength of women who turned transactional unions into legacies of love. Who took the cold arithmetic of the marriage market and warmed it with their breath and blood. Who, despite every inspection, every contract, every calculated match, somehow managed to make human connection flourish in the unlikeliest soil. The baby sighs in contentment. Somewhere, a betrothal is being negotiated. The wheel turns. The world continues. But in this humble room, for this fleeting moment, there exists only this. A woman, her child, and the unbreakable thread between them. And that, more than any alliance, any treaty, any carefully brokered marriage, changes everything. The embers glow faintly in the hearth as the old woman's hands, gnarled from decades of labor, smooth the wedding veil she once wore. 50 years have passed since her father traded her for 2 oxen and a promise. The groom is long dead, the oxen forgotten, but the fabric still holds the scent of lavender from that distant morning when when her life became someone else's bargain. This is the medieval marriage market's ultimate legacy, not in the grand treaties or bloodline continuations, but in these quiet moments of reckoning. The widow who outlived 3 husbands, the peasant woman whose children married better matches than she did, the noble matriarch who now arranges marriages with hands that once trembled under the same scrutiny. The system's genius was its cyclical nature. Girls raised on stories of their mother's submissions became mothers enforcing those same rules. The inspected became inspectors, the traded became traders. Every generation believed they were improving the process, softening the edges, until they found themselves repeating the same phrases. It's for your own good, and we know best, and the especially cruel, you'll understand someday. Yet the cracks persisted. In the bedtime stories, mothers whispered after official tales were done, the ones about clever peasant girls tricking their way to happiness. In the bawdy songs, laundresses sang about wives who dominated their households. Even in the legal records, where occasional entries glimmer with unexpected outcomes, the wife who inherited her merchant husband's business and tripled its profits, the childless widow who turned her dower lands into a sanctuary for runaway brides. The old woman folds the veil with hands that have delivered 13 grandchildren into this same system. Her granddaughter, bright-eyed and barely 12, watches with unconscious imitation. Soon enough, this girl will stand where she once stood, will feel the same weighing of hopes against practicalities. The cycle continues, but with subtle differences. Perhaps this girl will marry later, at 14 instead of 12. Maybe her dowry will include books along with linens. There might even be token questions about her preferences. The edges are softening, however, imperceptibly. As night deepens, the old woman surprises herself by tucking a sprig of rosemary into the folded veil, the same herb her own grandmother gave her for courage. When she presses it into her granddaughter's hands, she doesn't recite the usual warnings about obedience. Instead, she says something dangerous. Remember, no matter what they promise or demand, you will always belong to yourself first. The girl doesn't understand yet, but she will. When the negotiations begin, when the inspections commence, when the marriage bed looms, the words will return to her, a quiet rebellion passed hand to hand through generations of women who were never supposed to have inner lives. Because that was the medieval marriage market's fatal flaw. It could control land, bodies, even tongues, but never quite capture souls. The contracts faded, the alliances shifted, but the whispered truth between mothers and daughters, those survived everything. As the candle gutters out, the old woman smiles at a memory she'll never share aloud of a summer day long ago when a young man who wasn't her husband kissed her behind the barley stacks. Not because she loved him, she didn't. Not because she wanted to escape, she couldn't. But simply because in that moment, she could. The veil goes into the chest. The granddaughter goes to bed. The world turns toward morning. Somewhere, a new match is being proposed. Somewhere else, a girl is learning to read the subtle signs that her fate is being decided. The market continues its work. But in the darkness, if you listen closely, you might hear it. The faint, persistent sound of women breathing life into the spaces between the rules. Of hearts beating beneath the weight of contracts. Of the quiet, unkillable hope that maybe, just maybe, the next generation will find more room to choose. And with that hope, the story continues. Not with a bang or a climax, but with the steady persistence of dawn after dawn after dawn. The medieval marriage market may have written the rules, but women wrote between the lines. And those marginal notes, those whispered additions, those tiny acts of courage, they were the real history all along.